Okay, we'll just wait a minute or so as the participants join. Welcome, everyone. Great, so I will get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Marika, and I just wanted to say a very warm welcome from the alumni team here at King's. We're so grateful to have so many of you joining us today on Zoom for what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion. A big welcome also to those viewing this on YouTube. As some of you may know, this is one of a series that we've put together especially for members of the King's alumni community. Our King's Expert series showcases some of our academic and alumni expertise on some of the most pressing topics of our time. If you have a look on the alumni website, you'll find a full listing of all the events we have planned for the near future. If you haven't signed up already, we've got an update from King's leadership on August 5th with the principal, who'll be sharing a bit more about the university's response to the pandemic. So do be sure to tune in for that if you have questions. So we've got a fantastic panel of speakers lined up for you today. They're going to be sharing their unique perspectives on what we might be able to learn from the pandemic when it comes to climate change, looking at both some of the opportunities we might have in this area, as well as some of the parallels we might be able to draw between COVID-19 and the global climate crisis. Our chair for today's session is Professor Franz Berkhout, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Social Science and Public Policy at King's. He's also Professor of Environment, Society and Climate at the Department of Geography. Franz is a world-leading expert on science, public policy and climate change, and will be leading our discussion today. Hopefully you've all had the chance to read the impressive bios of our panel members. But just to summarize, we have with us today Dr. Mark Mulligan, Head of the Department of Geography, and also a member of our alumni community with a PhD from King's. Mark has been at King's since 1994. He is an honorary fellow of the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre. Dr. Sylvia Camprisi is a senior lecturer in bioethics and society at King's, as well as the director of the MSc in Bioethics and Society programme. Also a King's alumna, earning one of her PhDs from King's in 2013. Sylvia has an interdisciplinary background in biotechnology, ethics, and philosophy of medicine. Before I hand over to our chair, just a little bit about how the format of the webinar will work. So we'll first hear from each of our panelists for some background and context to the topic. And then this will be followed by an opportunity for Q&A. So if you do have a question for our panel, those of you on Zoom can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions directly to us. Do note we have a lot of you on the call today, so we may not have time to get to all of the questions, but you can also take part by upvoting other people's questions. So if you see one you really want answered, just hit the like button and that pushes them to the top of the list for us. I will now hand over to our chair for today's panel event, Professor Franz Berkhout.
Thanks, Marika. So welcome to everyone, and to this hour, I think, where we will try to discuss some of the really interesting issues about the COVID crisis and what it tells us in relation to climate change. We will give you some very brief ideas at the beginning. But of course, what we're really looking forward to is trying to discuss the questions you have. So we want to leave as much time as we can for that part of part of the webinar. So just three things I want to start at the beginning. The first is that clearly pandemics have been with human societies for thousands of years. And the reason they occur is because of this very close interaction between humans and particularly animals. And most of these are animal viruses, of course, which jump across. And they're also a feature of cities because you need large concentrations of people for epidemics to multiply and so on and become as destructive as they do. And therefore, in fact, at a time of much greater intensity of interaction with the global environment, with the growth of cities, pandemics are a feature of modern life, and increasingly we will likely see more pandemics as these kinds of interactions grow more intensive. So I think that's the first thing to say, is that this is a feature of modern civilizations, and in highly industrialized, urbanized societies, we will see many more of them in the future. The second thing, and in relation to climate change, is obviously it's an obvious remark, and many people have made it, is that because there's been this, stop to many activities and stop to many economies, and certainly, transport and so on, and many other activities have been stopped. The level of emissions, both carbon dioxide, but also other air emissions, has dramatically reduced. And indeed, in 2020, the modelers tell us that we might see between 8 and 10% less aggregate CO2 emissions. And that's obviously a positive thing. And it also demonstrates for the future what might be achievable in terms of rapid emissions declines as we move towards net zero sometime in the middle of the century. The final thing I'd say, though, is obviously one of the great puzzles and one of the great questions which policy researchers will be interested in is the degree to which the great changes we've seen in working patterns, in travel patterns, and so on, and perhaps also in the production of energy, whether those will stick and whether we will build back better, as it were, with these green recovery plans which many governments are talking about, or whether we will see a bounce back to many of the patterns of production and consumption and travel and so on that we saw before. And that's one of the great mysteries, actually, the question of whether this is a period of accelerated change towards more sustainable production, consumption, mobility systems, or whether it's simply a little interruption. And I think part of the discussion may be about that. So I'll stop there and then pass over now, first of all, maybe to Sylvia. Sylvia, if you could just put a few points on the table before we get into the general discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz, and welcome everybody. My perspective is a perspective on bioethics and climate change. What has bioethics to do with climate change? Many of you, when thinking about bioethics, will be thinking about CRISPR, genome editing, 3-parent baby, or latest technology. But actually, bioethics is much broader. Bioethics is anything that brings together bios, life, and the ethics of it. And going back to the original vision of bioethics, which was formulated in a little book published in 1971 called Bioethics, A Bridge to the Future, bioethics was really seen as a broader science for human survival. So thinking ahead at future generation and thinking of how we could leave a healthy planet to those who do not exist. Now, climate change poses a moral challenge because of the diffuseness of responsibility. Responsibility for climate change is scattered, and it's difficult to motivate us to act when we don't see the impact of our actions. We like to see or to think that our actions have a clear impact. Hence, many of the demands made by climate change activists in terms of changing our lifestyles, traveling less, traveling less by airplane, have been met with resistance. Now, here's where the pandemic comes in. The pandemic can show us, and it has shown us, that these drastic changes are possible, and are possible within a very quick time frame. We've seen it with lockdown policies enacted all over the world. And we've seen some of the effects already, as Professor Berghout was just telling us. So going forward, the pandemic can show us that it is possible to act, it is possible to motivate us to do something, and we are in all of this together. We are interconnected. There is a momentum that the pandemic has brought forward, a momentum in global risk and interconnectedness that we need to capitalize. We need to capitalize to act not only in relation to the pandemic and to the pandemics that will follow, because we need to be prepared to others and more terrible viruses spilling from animals to humans because of the disruptions, ecological system, and we need to be prepared to act for climate change. And the younger generation really, I think that have been bearing the brunt of the lockdown policies all over the world, can make reasonable demand to the older demographics in power to do something in order to ensure that there is a healthy planet for them.
Great, thank you very much, Sylvia, very interesting. Now over to Mark quickly with some introductory remarks.
Thank you. I also have 3 points, and I'd like to reflect on how the pandemic has changed our relationship with nature. On the one hand, I think we've been reminded that nature is still in charge and can stop us in our tracks and change everything we do. Secondly, the pandemic has shown us a number of positive impacts on nature, the return of wildlife to our cities, reductions in urban and industrial air pollution and noise pollution around us, and the recovery of roadside verges that are now looking much more like wildflower meadows, for example, and our reconnection with nature. We're listening again to bird song, we're in our gardens, we're walking in an enhanced nature. But there have also been negative impacts on nature of the pandemic, and they will continue over time. With a very large problem like COVID, we're ignoring other large problems like climate change and sustainability. Protected areas are now much less well protected than they were because there are few people watching and there is no revenue from ecotourism to keep them going. And the pandemic is also holding up processes of negotiation of biodiversity and climate change targets. So there are impacts of COVID as part of nature on us, but also impacts of COVID that are positive and negative on nature itself.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. So, I guess, Marika, we're waiting for questions, and here we've got one. So the first question is, could climate change have contributed to the emergence of many new viruses in the last few decades, including COVID-19? So that is a really interesting and complicated question to try to answer. Mark, I don't know whether you want to try and answer this. Let me have a stab at it, and then maybe you can add to it. So, the way in which viruses jump between species, and of course we know that this virus ends up not just in humans but in all sorts of other animals. Cats and mink get it as well, although maybe not with the same symptoms, is through very close interaction between humans and other species. In this case, it may have been pangolins or bats or whatever. The extent to which climate change, I suppose, has changed, environmental conditions, because it does. It leads to all sorts of changes in, physical conditions, temperature, humidity, storm, sea level rise, all sorts of effects on the physical environment, which then may influence the niches within which viruses themselves develop, may have had an effect. But the crucial interaction and the thing that leads to devastating novel viruses is clearly this interaction, this direct interaction between people and other species. And I'm not sure that we could argue that those interactions in any direct or simple way are being affected by climate change. But Mark, I don't know whether you have another way into this very interesting question.
I agree, it's an interesting question. I think both climate change and the emergence of new viruses are driven by the same drivers. So deforestation, roads, transport, these are all big factors that drive climate change. And they're also big factors that drive the connectedness of novel viruses with humanity and their spread around the world. So it's not necessarily the case that climate change is a driver, but that climate change is driven by the same processes as new viruses like COVID. We know, for example, that there is a temperature relationship, and there are certainly a relationship between ultraviolet radiation and the breakdown of viruses outside of the body. But I don't see any other strong sort of climate relationships for the emergence of new viruses.
I mean, there are relationships between vector-borne diseases and climate change, and these are modelable. And of course, what you see is, I mean, in Europe, where we are, the emergence of endemic tropical diseases, particularly in southern Europe, have moved in with mosquitoes and also insects which affect trees and plants. These have come into, they're moving north and south indeed in the southern hemisphere. So clearly there is an effect on life and pests, but whether they have a direct impact on the emergence or viability of viruses, I'm less sure that we have science on that. Sylvia, anything you want to say on this question, or should we pass on?
I was only going to add that a point related to interconnectedness. So really our health of the human species is interconnected to the health of non-human species. So while we cannot really draw causal links between climate change and spillovers, we can see that disruption to ecosystem lead to both climate change and spillovers. And we need to step back from our anthropocentric view that puts us as human beings in the center and all the other non-human species around or on a descending staircase, and really adopt a different view, which is a One Health view.
Okay, very good. So I think where we came out there is that the drivers of climate change are very similar to the drivers of COVID. And in fact, it's dealing with those underlying drivers which will allow us to deal with both issues together. So then a question from Barry Koidan. I don't see much evidence of developed world's leaders keen to do anything other than to get back to normal, that is continued growth. What will persuade them to change? So, so there is, of course, a lot of cynicism, I think, about the policy intentions as political leaders, finance ministers try to get economies back on track. Who wants to start with this? Sylvia, do you have a perspective on whether all these green growth plans that people talk about, and there are large newspaper adverts from captains of industry saying, build back better and so on. Is this all greenwash and so on, or should we believe it?
It's definitely a challenge. One of the challenges of climate change is that politicians or world leaders necessarily adopt a shorter time frame than what is needed. Their time frame is really the next election and getting, enough votes to be reelected. But here we need much broader time frame. one way of persuading the world leaders could really to connect climate change with health as a value and with the economy. So not seen as separate, but seen those as complementary. Climate change and health and economic growth can go well together. And here's where, you know, private sector and corporate responsibility in terms of sustainable development can come in, because as individuals, as I was going back to my earlier point, it will be very difficult to see, you know, the impact of our actions. So even if we might be motivated by, I don't know, our children or grandchildren, still we need I would say that the private sector investing in corporate responsibility for a sustainable development, and I think there are examples of that.
Okay, Mark, anything to say on this?
Sure, I think there are some really interesting parallels between political response to COVID and to climate change and environmental change in general. On the one hand, big shifts and new norms are clearly possible because they've just happened, but they will only tend to occur when there's no other choice. I think that's been clear in COVID and is becoming clear in climate change. Acute challenges, like we see with COVID, will tend to generate a much more rapid and significant response than, as we're seeing now, than chronic problems such as climate change, which is longer term, until they become acute, those chronic problems, for enough people to make the leaders, world leaders, change their minds. And in the case of COVID, clearly everyone's affected. In the case of climate change, it's still the world's poorest that are mainly affected.
Mm. Okay, so I guess I have a slightly more positive spin on this, because I think it depends on where we are in terms of the technological and economic potentials of new ways of working, new technologies which are associated with, for instance, going to net zero. I mean, it seems to me that actually one of the things that the COVID crisis has shown us is the huge potential of digital technology to substitute for travel, for instance, or the ability that it allows us to think of completely new ways of working, and perhaps allowing us to think differently about the role of cities and so on, the journey to work and how often we need to do that. And I think there are many parts of that which will be, as it were, baked in. I think a similar thing will happen with renewables, renewable energy, is that actually, you know, we need more electricity, of course, to power all these new digital systems. The way that we're going to produce that electricity in the future increasingly is through renewable energy. So if you look at, you know, the big programs, the big infrastructure programs which are being proposed in many countries, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world as well, it's going to be huge investments in these new cleaner technologies, because that's the direction of industrial and economic and technological change right now. And in a way, you can accelerate towards those cleaner, greener, more sustainable ways of doing things and technologies. And I think, therefore, you know, the timing of this crisis is very interesting because it has all these potentials. We've seen them all, and now we have the potential to embed them. And I think many policymakers see that as well. So let's see. Okay, so then a question from Christopher Gordon. One of the solutions mooted for dealing with climate change is greater urbanization in cities. With COVID-19, cities, especially those with large informal settlements, become hotspots and impossible to control measures like social distancing to work. How will this tension play out in the future? Really interesting question. What will happen to cities? So who am I going to ask first? Mark, why don't you start with that one, and we'll all consider it in some way. Very interesting question.
Sure. I think, you know, cities are important. Obviously, that's where most of humanity is nowadays, and is a significant footprint environmentally, particularly in climate change. But it's really not the big issue environmentally, because their footprint is only a couple of % of the land surface of the Earth. And most of the land surface of the Earth is covered in agriculture. And if we can do agriculture better, that will actually have a huge impact. In fact, there's, you know, beyond cities, In cities, it's energy and resource efficiency that we really need to focus on, because using less energy means we have to produce less energy by whatever technology, and renewable energy isn't entirely free of environmental impact. We need to leave tropical forests intact, we need to do agriculture better, and we need to understand and manage landscapes better for fire. And those things, I think, probably are less of an impact in terms of COVID than cramming people into cities. And I, picking up on your previous point about transport and teleworking and so on, we might even see the opposite, a move away from city centres and the spreading of the population further afield.
Sylvia, anything on the future of cities?
No, I don't have much to add on this point, except that, yeah, I think I agree with Mark that we will see actually a drive away from cities, also in terms not only of climate change or COVID, but mental health challenges. And I know that also at King's, we have esteemed colleague working on mental health and cities such as Nicholas Rose and others. But I would add the point related to your earlier point about new jobs or electricity. I see another question that it might partially answer in terms of low-income countries and what kind of jobs will be created. Now, I think we really need to stop thinking about climate change or health in silos. We need to think creatively about how to address the challenge of climate change as a pandemic, and at the same time, continue creating jobs, and this will be different jobs. So electricity is really a great example, and I'm aware of many initiatives bringing electricity in different forms to low and middle income countries, such as mini grids is a great example. And this will bring jobs and potentially would be a more effective way of impacting on the health of low middle income countries, where COVID is not the most pressing global health problems. There are other health challenges that need to be tackled before or ahead of COVID in low middle income countries. So it cannot be a one size fit all solution. It needs to be contextual, and it needs to be thought creatively so that the health challenge can be met together with the climate change challenge and the economy challenge.
Just to get back quickly to the question about cities, I mean, I think cities are incredibly resilient things. I don't think that COVID will lead to a reduction in the trend towards urbanization. I think there are all sorts of reasons why cities still work. The functional distance as we all know, in relation to infection is about 2 meters. And it means you can't get very many people into a room, but 2 meters is not a difficult distance in terms of most cities. I think the point you make about informal settlements is right, but all I would tend to say is what we already know, is that much more investment needs to go into improving the conditions in informal settlements, but even well-planned informal settlements with high densities can be safe places even in a pandemic. And I'd also say that one of the things about a more dispersed population is that then when people do need to travel, they travel to work or for leisure or for shopping or whatever, they need to travel longer distances. The great thing about cities, of course, they're dense places. One of the things we've learned in COVID, certainly in London, is that there's a huge demand now for alternative ways of moving around the city. There's a global shortage of bicycles, for instance. Now, the bicycle becomes a really functional way of moving large numbers of people around in cities, in fact, and that's what you'll see, probably the evacuation of the car from many city centres as people begin to walk and cycle as a way of trying to avoid some forms of public transport. So there are advantages to the recovery of from COVID in having people in a dense way, but of course enabling them to move around in new ways which perhaps don't, involve them being very close together on the journeys that they're doing. Right, so Mike Gallagher, some believe that the green economy will emerge from the crisis and that new jobs will replace many of those which have been lost and won't return. Is this realistic, especially so in low-income countries? So I think, Sylvia, you've begun to discuss this one. Again, it's a very big and very interesting question, and I guess there are different ways into this. We are clearly at some kind of tipping point in relation to the organization of economies and the kind of dominant technologies that are here, the internal combustion engine, the fossil fuel power station, and so on. All these things are beginning to be a thing of the past as we electrify much more and as we seek to do things in more efficient ways. There are a whole cluster of new technologies that enable us, for instance, to communicate in this way, that will enable this new future to come to fruition. These are great, long historical processes. There are economists like Schumpeter and others who talk about long waves in economic development. We're probably in a period when digital and an understanding of genomes and all of that potential is becoming the dominant socio-technological configuration. And they will create all sorts of new industries and new jobs. We don't know quite how that will unfold, but we are seeing the end of one period of history and the beginning of another. And obviously we know that being safe in terms of things like pandemics, but it's also safe in terms of our climate, is going to be fundamental to what the new era holds. So I think it is realistic to think about a completely new kind of economy and involving many different ways of doing things, different kinds of technologies. Mark, is there anything else you wanted to say in relation to Mike Gallagher's question?
Yes, thank you. I would add probably that what we do over the next 3 years to come out economically of this pandemic will probably train the environment, the economy, and our emissions for the next 30 years at least. And so I think there is an impetus to come out of this in a more sustainable way than we were in beforehand. Some of that involves bypassing what we now know to be bad technology. A lot of the sort of grey infrastructure that you were talking about, a lot of the work that I do is on dams and reservoirs. And it's the case in Africa, just as it moved straight to the mobile technology and bypassed landlines, that we don't have to do in Africa the same as we saw in North America and in Europe, a move to dam all of the rivers, when instead we can achieve some of those benefits through working with the green infrastructure that's already there, the wetlands, the forests, and so on, to better provide water in all seasons. Clearly, we need dams for hydropower, but beyond that, I think there are labor-intensive mechanisms of working better with nature to come out of the pandemic more sustainably.
Great. And then Arthur Quenner, what do you think is the effect of extreme cold due to climate change on increased COVID infections? So let me start with that, and maybe then I'll hand over to Sylvia. There's some new research actually published yesterday by health researchers at King's that does find a temperature relationship within levels of infection. And it appears that looking at large panels, I think they were looking at 40,000 people in Europe and China, that there is, for every degree centigrade of warmth that we've seen in the spring to summer period, there is something like a 15% reduction in rates of infection. Now, Some of that may have to do with other factors, social distancing, better awareness, all those kinds of things. But clearly, warmth, which was always projected to be an effect, does have a measurable effect. And that's why we have flus and these kinds of respiratory diseases. We tend to get them in cold periods of the year, and there's something to do with the infectivity of these kinds of diseases that has to do with the ambient temperature. So there is a relationship there. I mean, climate change, Arthur, is usually linked to greater warmth, of course. And so you might argue that, over long term, I mean, of course, there's always, we still have the seasons, even with climate change. But as things maybe warm up, then possibly there are certain kinds of viruses which will find it more difficult to perpetuate themselves. On the other hand, I think there's such a range of viruses, I don't think we could ever depend on that effect as being very, very important. Sylvia, is there anything you want to say about cold or heat and infection?
It's a very difficult question. I think it's very difficult to answer this question on the basis of the data that we could build, because how can we establish really a causal effect between extreme cold that is due to climate change and increased COVID infection? But I think it's a very interesting question in terms of the topic it raises of temperature-wise and viruses tropism. And it's true that we have such a variety of viruses that we need to be prepared to what they can to spill over. I haven't read this research that you were mentioning, Franz, but I've read other interesting research on the point of viruses and SARS-CoV-2 and the disease COVID-19 being more severe in professional athletes, which I thought was very interesting in terms of it's a paper. First author was Matricardi, and the authors argued on the basis of a inhalation hypothesis that in professional athletes who are doing strenuous, very intense exercise, SARS-CoV-2 basically has is facilitated to reach the lungs, and where it can cause a severe infection. And this is also interesting finding in relation to lockdown policy. So I am originally Italian, and I've been writing against the ban on running in Italy during the lockdown, because I thought that from a public health ethics point of view, it was not ethically justified. However, now if this finding is replicated, it could seem that, well, it would be better not to do any strenuous exercise. So,
not to breathe too deeply.
Yeah, we are accumulating evidence as we go along in the pandemic. This would be the point. I would be a bit wary of drawing causal links between climate change and increased infection, but we are accumulating evidence. So it is something that we might have been justified in phase 1 might not be justified in phase 2. So that's the point of evidence base.
Yeah. And I think the point you're making as well is that each virus is different, of course, and we can't tell, what the characteristics will be of the next novel virus. Mark, should we? Do you have anything to say about this one, or should we pass on?
I would just add that clearly in cold periods and at cold times, we tend to coop up indoors and not be outside a lot. That puts us in much greater proximity, touching surfaces and so on. And this is the one of the reasons why we have flus in the winter. And the other is that with extreme cold, I agree with you that I don't think anyone really knows. Cold, yes, we might be able to see associations, as you say, but extreme cold is a different matter.
Okay. Then David Steele, thinking of Francis' comments about future pandemics, how likely is the emergence of a pathogen that could kill a significant proportion of the human population, like the Black Death? You know, just to remind you, there are parts of the world, and the Black Death, the plague, of course, affected, you know, was a global phenomenon. And in parts of the world, it killed a third or a half of populations. So it was really an unbelievably devastating disease. These in the 15th century, the 14th century, and so on. A significant proportion of the human before we can develop medical solutions. So, you know, the modelers, I suppose, would say that there is a great chance of a novel virus or pathogen emerging at some point that could be extremely devastating and have a very high death rate. So, you know, the death rate for COVID is probably 1% or slightly lower. But if you had you know, Ebola was much higher. Sylvia, you'll remind me what it was, but it was, you know, something closer to 20%. If you had I think the thing though is that what we've learnt, and certainly what was learnt in East Asia with SARS and MERS, it was to be able to respond very quickly. The reason this COVID has had such a devastating effect in Europe, in North America, now in Latin America, is that actually in those countries, we'd failed to learn the lessons that have been learned in China and Korea and Japan and Taiwan and so on. So that I think if a virus or a pathogen like this emerged that was really very, very dangerous, the responses would be immediate. We would have learned a huge amount from COVID. We would have absolute lockdown policies and social distancing, and we would have a similar kind of scientific response to seek to understand the disease and to develop new drugs and you know, interventions to deal with it. So I suspect the difference between the 14th century and now is that we actually have highly capable states and very developed international global health systems, and we know broadly what we need to do. It's not actually that complicated. When an infection like this happens, you need to keep people apart and stop and kill the infection in that way. Sylvia, anything, you know, are we going to experience a Black Death? We've all watched Contagion, of course, over the lockdown and seen how that worked in a truly terrifying story that is. But what else can you tell us about future pandemics?
I would only add that as a bioethicist, I'm into science fiction. So bioethics loves science fiction because of we love our dystopic futures, Orwellian future, and we love to think about those socio-technological futures to reflect on what we can do now. So there's an interesting phenomenon called causal inversion, which means that we think about a technological future, which could be, you know, the next pandemic, would be also what we can do with CRISPR, genome editing embryos and creating a, you know, subspecies within a human species. And then we do something in the here and now to either enable or prevent that future. So that means that, you know, it's really important to think about those socio-technological futures, to act in the here and now with policy, and that we can be prepared and do something about those futures.
I think this has been a huge learning experience for governments and for societies everywhere. And the next time there is an event like this, there will be a much more effective and rapid response globally. And hopefully that will have the effect of, you know, bringing the pandemic under control and responding to it more rapidly. Mark, anything you want to say about the Black Death?
I would just add that you know, there'll likely be a vaccine for COVID, and as you say, we'll be better prepared next time. It's not as simple for climate change or environmental change. There's no vaccine for that. That needs sustained effort, you know, not just now, but all the time in the future to keep a handle on that. Otherwise, we'll have second and third and fourth waves of climate change and environmental degradation.
Okay, great. So then there's a question from Anonymous. There are more cars on the roads now because people are being told not to use public transport. How can we make public transport safe? Yeah, really interesting question. Sylvia, do you want to? Well, let me start by thinking about this. So, you're right that, of course, people are being encouraged to travel to work, and we see that at King's. So, I mean, just to give you an example, our wet labs opened about three weeks ago, and because, of course, a lot of the science has to be picked up again and started again, and we were worried about the safety of people coming to work, and we've offered them all sorts of alternatives. If they had a bike, obviously we encourage them, but many people live too far away, and therefore we've arranged taxis and things like that. And that is leading to a buildup of congestion. And I'm sure we've all experienced that. Now, as we come out of lockdown, that's going to be unsustainable very rapidly. I mean, most cities won't be able to cope if the millions of people who travel in by public transport seek to do that by car. So we're going to have to find a way of making public transport safe. There are simple things like face coverings and scheduling and so on. You know, I think a lot of work will be done at home, and therefore the need for the journey to work, certainly in the period when we still are very concerned about infection, will be radically reduced. And I'm sure many people on the call have been told by their companies or organizations they're probably not going to be expected back in work, you know, full time, at least until the end of the year or maybe further. So I think the demand for public transport will be lower. But clearly this is one of the great critical issues, is how you get still large numbers of people onto buses and trains and into public transport, but in a safe way. And I suppose track and trace and following infections and making sure you sit on the virus when it does emerge. There's no alternative in most cases to reactivating public transport. And I think that's the way people, for certain kinds of journeys, will continue to travel in the future as well. Sylvia, anything on public transport?
I would only add that this is both a great challenge, but also an opportunity to rethink the future of transportations, both in terms of public transports in London, of course, but in big hubs, but also in terms of cars. So we do have, you know, electric cars, and we have in the future driverless cars, and those raise a unique ethical challenges and new instantiation of all the philosophical trolley problems, which, so it seems that philosophy plays a role into public policy, but these challenges again need to be tackled creatively, thinking on different levels, and there cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution. What works, what could work in London would not work in India or in Africa, or so we need to think about the local context and the priorities, and in that context, so it needs to be a bottom-up approach and not a, you know, one-size-fits-all approach.
Mark,
Nothing further from me.
No, nothing further on this. Okay, so then there's a question: how do we tackle the issue of increased waste, especially plastic waste, that seems to currently be happening because of the need for greater sanitation? Yeah, very interesting question. It appeared we were making positive steps to a mindset change amongst consumers that could be driven backwards from the shift in lifestyles that has been happening. Yeah, so I think we've all, you know, obviously, you know, a lot of personal protective equipment is plastic. So, you know, as we return to work, and certainly of course in health services, huge amounts of plastic waste are being generated, but there's also the changes in behavior around food, for instance, and retail. requiring the delivery, the Deliveroo phenomenon, and the Amazon phenomenon, which is the way I suppose many of us have been supplied in the last few months, generates absolutely epic amounts of new plastic waste. I think that is one of the great concerns. Hopefully we won't always need to operate with PPE, and Deliveroo and so on, I think, is probably here to stay. But again, I think picking up on one of the lines Sylvia's been using, I think this is probably also a stimulus for innovation. I think consumers and probably producers are inherently uncomfortable with the need to use so much plastic, but also just generate so much waste. We see it on our city streets as well. There's food packaging everywhere right now, and we have to get over that. And I suppose looking for alternative ways of doing that is going to be, one of the great technological business opportunities in the future as well. I don't quite know what the right answer is on plastic waste, but that's what I would be thinking. Sylvia, are you Deliveroo sort of person, or do you have everything delivered by Amazon, or what are you doing? What do you think the solution is here?
Yes, I am on both accounts, but I would add on the, for example, face masks. Face mask, you can have safe face masks that are not made of plastic. And so you can have the fashion industry produce, different face masks built of different fabrics that can still be safe, but also that can be fashionable, so that it becomes an item of clothing. And this is what, again, the Italian fashion industry has been doing, so that it becomes something that you want to wear. I don't know about food packaging, what I could add, but it was a problem before, when we used to buy our yogurts, and each of those yogurts is packaged individually. And so that's a stimulus for rethinking that. But yeah, I don't know what the right solution is, but it's, a huge, as you said, epic issue.
Mark, I imagine you're very eco-friendly, aren't you? You don't have any of these problems.
I use plenty of plastic like everyone else. I do try. I think this question is an example, good example of how any sustainability solution that we put in place has to be resilient to crises. You can't put a solution in place that just works when the going is good. It has to be longer term. And I think, there are alternatives to plastic. We weren't far enough along the curve in using those pre-COVID, maize-based material plastics and so on, to have the factories that produce PPE do that, right? Because they were still very much working around plastic. And as I think I agree with you that this is where technological innovation needs to come in as well, because we know, again, harking back to rainforests and biodiversity, we have found species of fungi in rainforests that can biodegrade plastic. Right? And it's just a case of going back again with the biological scientists and getting that sorted in a way that's sustainable.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, to King's alumni, there's a huge business opportunity in here. And if you have a cool idea, then do get out there. So we've got about 7 minutes to go. So, and I've got 3 questions there. Ahmed Zaid, in terms of the activities that halted due to COVID, which had the most positive effect on climate change? And what is being done to keep the wheel turning in the right direction? Some suggestions for wrapping up. Okay, so maybe we can each make one bid. Okay, so I'll start with, I think, air travel is responsible for about 4 or 5% of global emissions and rising very rapidly. And I think, broadly that's been curtailed in many parts of the world. Of course, there's still quite a lot of air travel going on in North America, but in the rest of the world, we don't see contrails above our cities anymore. And I think not only the immediate curtailment of air travel, but actually the radical rethinking of what air travel should be for. And all this restructuring we see in the aviation industry means that actually in future, we're likely to have much less of that. So I suspect actually it's the real shock and realization that you know, very rapid growth of air travel, that has probably come to, we might have seen peak air travel and be doing it for other reasons. And I think that has probably been the most, as it were, having the most positive impact in terms of emissions. Sylvia, what would your bid be?
I was going to respond to Humberto Santoyo Ruiz, if that's okay, as a suggestion.
Okay, sure.
For wrapping up. So Humberto asked, do you think the pandemic will raise the general perception on scientific facts, particularly on climate change deniers and anti-vaxxers from citizens to governments? That's a great point, and I really hope that's the case. We were living pre-COVID in challenging times in which we see a decrease in trust in expert knowledge in a variety of contexts, from climate change to medicine. And, you know, social sciences have been investigating the factors that lead to decreased trust and how we can then create an informed public health policy that would tackle those challenges. So it seems that now the experts that are being called upon are often scientists in the case of COVID, and this could lead to the perception that, well, we have the solution also to other issues. It is not that simple, because also science works on uncertainties. There is disagreement, genuine disagreements, epistemic disagreement within scientists that is there. That's how science and research proceeds on the basis of uncertainty and disagreement. So I think we need, as a society, to learn more about how really research works and to deal with that uncertainty, and then learn on how that can feed into public policy, because it's not the case that the science, operates with one single voice, but that doesn't mean, on the other hand, that it will lead to deniers.
Yeah.
That made sense.
Okay. No, that does. I think a lot of climate scientists are very jealous, actually, of the virologists and medics who stand beside prime ministers and presidents and decide what we will all be doing. But I think the point you make is a really interesting one. So maybe we should then go to the final one, Mark, given that we've only got 3 minutes. Richard Curtis, what advice can you give to young people about the way they could live their lives in future that would tackle the problems being discussed today? Mark, any advice to a young person in relation to climate change and maybe, crises and pandemics?
I would say learn about it, understand the science as best you can, and in terms of your own contribution, I think be politically active, but also think about what you consume and where it comes from. In particular, there are some easy wins. Keeping tropical forests intact can do a huge amount to continue to mitigate climate change. They're the worst agricultural land. What we grow there, we can grow better in other places. And so consumer choices are really driving deforestation around the world. It is not a case that deforestation is by poor local people trying to make a living. It's large-scale agricultural deforestation. So just being aware is important, getting involved, but also being very careful about what you believe and what you read. Because one thing that we have seen very clearly in COVID, that we also see in climate change, is that disinformation can look credible, sometimes not, and can spread very quickly.
Okay, very interesting. Sort of an effective model of disinformation. So yes, I think what Mark is saying there is, you know, be informed, get active, think about your own choices in your own life, and you know, innovate as well. I think, you know, there's a huge potential for people to, you know, think of new ways of doing things that can actually lead to quite dramatic changes in their own footprint on the earth. Okay, I think we're going to stop. It is 6:30. I just want to wrap up there and thank you all for some really challenging questions. I'm not sure we were able always to answer the question. The one that sticks in my mind is the one about cold and infectivity. But these are really grand challenges. I suppose I just leave you by saying that at King's, and we're so pleased that you could join us today, we will continue to be doing research in these areas of climate change, society, ethics, policy, pandemics, health, and so on, of course. We hope that, you know, we can keep you informed with the work that we're doing. If at some stage you're thinking about coming back into education, maybe postgraduate, then we're always here and we're always keen to welcome back our own alumni to come and work with us and become part of our community again. So thank you very much indeed, very much. And I'm going to stop there, and I guess Marika will come back to us. Is that correct?
I'm here. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. We'll end the call now, I think. Thank you all for joining us.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.